So today I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on since 2021. And this project is one that, due to recent developments in Twitter, has become something of a historical curiosity very recently. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this talk is going to be very recently in the past tense. And so I think that aspect of it will be interesting for those of you who have done or are doing Twitter research. And I do want to devote some time during Q&A to the general, if folks are interested, to the general discussion of where social media research is going, given recent changes to access to data at Twitter and through other social media channels for the platforms. But before I get to that, I'll sort of talk you through this particular project, which I think is interesting, even though it's basically done. Well, the data collection are done, still got to write papers. But it was sort of intended initially to be an ongoing project. Unfortunately, that Elon Musk put a stop to that real quick. But you know, that is what it is. So I like to start by talking about echo chambers and filter bubbles, which are terms with which many of you may be familiar. The general idea here is that people, through the use of technology, can ensconce themselves within impenetrable, difficult to penetrate if you will, bubbles that are reinforcing of people's pre-existing beliefs and screening out all content that doesn't do those things. Now, personally, I don't really love this framing. It's what I call, it has, I guess, what you might call that crossover appeal. So you might, see it being talked about on, the front page of the New York Times. Other non-academic outlets would be talking about this. I don't really think it's great. So oftentimes this happens in academia, right? Something migrates its way out. See also like critical race theory, like it comes out of academia and then like loses all meaning. And I think, I believe that echo chambers kind of is a similar thing. So I think we kind of need to move beyond this idea for a number of reasons that I'll touch on throughout this talk. So rather than echo chambers or filter bubbles, I like to talk about personalized information environments. Now, personalized, or as I call them, personalized information environments are co-constructed by users and platforms. And so we are all familiar with the user component of this. When you go to a social media system and you signal the kind of content that you would like to receive, either by following certain accounts, engaging with certain types of content, liking, sharing, commenting, etc., providing signals that the algorithm then throws back in your face. And so that will be the piece of it will be the algorithmic piece, some piece of code out there that tries to read the tea leaves of your digital traces and tries to give you back some content that the system thinks that you'll like. Now, importantly, this personalized information environment framework implies nothing about the contents of the environment, which may vary widely according to a number of factors. So, what I'm basically saying here is that the echo chamber ideal kind of puts the theoretical cart before the horse a little bit, and the personalized information environments kind of puts the cart and the horse back in the right order. Basically by saying, we are asking questions about the content of our personalized information environments, rather than assuming, through the use of this antiquated theoretical term, that it is one way or another. Theoretical pedigree here may be meaningful or less meaningful to some of you. Mass self-communication is a term that was often bandied about in my graduate department, which my fellow graduate student at the time, Chris Wells here, will attest. Disintermediate media systems, that's very hard to say. And public sphere tools is also hard to say. But these are all terms that helped to inform, or theories rather, that helped to inform my conceptualization of the personalized information environment. And so we come to the user eye view. This is not a new concept. A person who really contributed very strongly to this is Erica Mengen-Gravino, who teaches at my former employer, American University, and she talks about vertical data, which is data that's very deep with respect to individuals, rather than being very broad and thin, which is lots of platform-centric data, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But this is one concept that could use a fresh coat of conceptual paint. It's getting more and more popular these days. I'm certainly not the only one to try to do user eye or user-centric research, and I'll talk about some of the other platforms that have done this on subsequent slides. The purpose of this research is, as much as possible, to see as the user sees. Unfortunately, doing so is easier said than done, and is quite methodologically difficult and expensive. And so at this point, I probably gratefully acknowledge funding from the Knight Foundation, which founded our research center, or was funded rather, our research center, the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, and provided the funding to allow us to be able to develop the tool that I'll talk about in a little bit. So the platform-centric view is something that will be familiar to any person who has conducted social media research. Now, this particular chart is adapted from a very famous study conducted by Adamick and Glantz almost 20 years ago. And this was a study, or one of the studies, one of the main studies that really introduced the idea of the computational study of digital traces of online communication to the communication field. It's not in the common journal, it's an archived conference in information science. But what they did was they pulled a lot of data off of the blogosphere, as it was called at that time, and they were able to demonstrate that the left-leaning blogs, which is the blue cluster on the left, densely interlinked among themselves using hyperlinks, and on the right-hand side, the right-leaning clusters did the same among themselves, and then between the two, the connections were only quite sparse. And this was quite groundbreaking at the time, although if you know this research, it's probably one of the best known findings from this kind of research that exists. But at the time, this was quite a new thing, both methodologically and empirically to be able to demonstrate this. But what makes it platform-centric is the fact that they sort of went out there, collected the data, if you think about the blogosphere as a platform, pulled it out, and then were able to examine it on that basis. So when we talk about platform versus user views, these are two different perspectives that are applicable to different research questions. I certainly don't want to leave you with the impression that the user eye view is in any way a panacea or superior to the platform-centric view. They're just different perspectives that are useful for different purposes. So the platform view is good for studying particular topics. This is one that I've used a number of times. Some of you may also have done similar things. And so one good example of this is when I did a study and a report on the genesis of Black Lives Matter a few years ago. And I used Twitter as one of the main platforms to pull the data out of, try to figure out how the content spread, who were the first ones to spread it, who were the elites that really made it go viral, all that sort of thing. And so Twitter was the platform, and I was able to gather a lot of data about Black Lives Matter, specifically on Twitter. It's also really good, this platform-centered view is really good for understanding online group dynamics, because you get to marshal the longitudinal aspect of the data to try to figure out how social mediated communication changes over time. And so that's really good because socially mediated communication on social media is often changing. And so understanding those online group dynamics in a longitudinal way is really important. And then, this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. Another thing that's really good for is examining influencers and who they influence, right? We know that one of the major ways this was revealed, anybody who's been paying attention to this may be aware of the fact that Twitter recently made available on an open source basis its recommendation algorithm. And one of the things that came out of the revelation, the open sourcing of this algorithm, is how Twitter prioritizes content from different people. And so one of the ways that we knew that they did this before, but the algorithm made it explicit in the code, is that if you are a verified account, you will receive greater visibility. Now, obviously, there's been a bit of a wrench thrown into that now that you can get verified for $8 a month, but the sort of status quo ante of verification was intended to elevate people who had some level of social, political, cultural notability. And And so that was something that would elevate the content that they put onto the platform simply by dint of having access to that blue check. Now, the user eye view is good for a separate but complementary set of research goals, including understanding the content of specific personalized information environments. So a good example will help explain why this is important and useful. So imagine that you have a social media system where you've got a fair amount of content of ill repute, right? Could be, you know, disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, whatever you want to imagine. But imagine that this content is not seen by anyone, right? So either the algorithm downgrades it or nobody's following these accounts. We don't really care about it quite so much if nobody sees it. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with our user eye work is to try to figure out how much low quality content people are actually seeing, which is a separate analytical question from how much low quality content is on the platform. And so you need to use different tools to answer the former question relative to the latter. Former is a user eye question, the latter is a platform question. Secondly, determining how the information diversity of a particular set of personalized information environments changes over time. So the mix of all of the content that you get through your social media feeds, to a large extent will determine, you know, what you're thinking about and the political content that you're exposed to. But that's not something that you can understand if you're just pulling things out of a platform. You need to be able to find the feeds of the people who are consuming this content, analyzing it for information diversity to understand, you know, just how diverse of a, you know, set of content that each individual is receiving. Thirdly, and one that I will do in this very presentation, is to ascertain the amount of low-fact content in people's streams, which is a pretty, you know, as these things go, it's pretty low-hanging fruit, right? We are concerned as a, you know, group of scholars who are studying this as well as a society, with the amount of disinformation, misinformation, et cetera, that people are consuming. And these kinds of techniques can help us understand the extent to which this stuff shows up in people's personalized information environments. That's good. So before I get to my particular project, I want to talk about some other platforms and systems that allow this kind of work to be done, to contrast them with the way that my system works, or our system works. And this is really important because every user-centric system is a little bit different in terms of how it operates, in terms of its capabilities, its strengths and weaknesses. And so understanding these will help you to compare and give some sense of how my system operates with respect to these more established alternatives. So I'll be talking about NetQuest and some of the other comparable commercial platforms that allow for this, WebHistorian, which was developed by Erica Mention-Urbina, what I mentioned earlier, and Screenomics, which was developed by an excellent team of scholars at Stanford University. So NetQuest, you know, I probably should rethink the slide a little bit. I don't want to, you know, shine a light on NetQuest too much, because it's really meant to be emblematic of a number of commercial services that offer very similar, you know, products. So NetQuest is a company who's, among other things, produces data that they pull from a platform, from a panel of users that they recruit, and they set these users up with software that runs on their mobile and their desktop or laptop devices. And what this software does is it collects data on every URL that they access through their browsers. And so, every time you are on your browser, if you're part of this NetQuest panel, you're clicking your way through the internet, you're looking at this and that, and it's taking all this data, storing it at NetQuest Central, and then they sell that to third-party individuals, some of whom are corporate, some of whom are academics. And so the data that you get from this include things like web URLs, the domains, and then the timestamps when people actually visited this content. And you may also get some, you know, some of the basic demographics of people that are involved in the panel as well. So researchers can see whatever you happen to have visited. So this is really, really great if you want to see where people are focusing their attention. But as we'll see in a little bit, it doesn't show them things, it doesn't, it's not really great for social media because you can't see content that people merely saw but didn't actually click on. So Web Historian is a really nice alternative. One of the advantages it has over NetQuest and its commercial competitors is that it's free and open source, which is great. It is a browser extension that reads users' Chrome history, so one disadvantage is Chrome only. And like the commercial services, it collects full URLs and timestamps. As I mentioned earlier, it's open source. It's also available to end users who want a little bit of insight into their browsing habits. And this is a visualization that would be of the type that would be offered to users who installed this. And so you can see the size of each bubble represents the prevalence of this domain in their browsing history. So this is just an example. This is not mine. This is an example that I pulled off of the Web Historian website. So you can see that among the domains that loom large in this particular person's personalized information environment are Google Docs, Craigslist, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, etc., Hulu. And so this is a nice little visualization and also something that we took inspiration from in terms of us using our product to offer our end users in our panel a little something extra in addition to the monetary compensation that we gave to them. Last one to talk about is Screenomix, which is produced by the Human Screenome Project at Stanford University, hosted by the great Violet Reeves. This is a really neat project where the panel that they've got working with this installs software on their devices that takes a screenshot every 5 seconds. And what's really nice about that is that it is not in any way browser or operating system. Well, they support multiple operating systems, but it's not app specific. So anything that is on their screen, whether it be mobile or laptop or desktop, it's going to take a picture of that. Which means, of course, it's not limited to social media or even apps that are connected to the internet. Supports Windows, Mac, and Android, and then on the back end, they conduct OCR, which is optical character recognition, automated image tagging, and human labeling. Now, that sounds like a whole lot of work to me, but they have a lot of money over there, so they're getting it done. Now, the other problem is that they're not able to extract things from the underlying source code of the web pages or anything like that, because they're only able to get those flat screen grabs. And so the nature of the data that you're able to pull from this is different because they have to basically flatten everything to be able to have that cross-app compatibility. And so again, we see that each of these solutions has its own advantages and disadvantages. Which leads me to our innovation, which is called PIEGraph. Once again, PI stands for Personalized Information Environment, and graph stands for something that is definitely not a chart, because pie charts are terrible information visualization tools that shouldn't be used by anyone. Like the other ones that I talked about, PIEGraph is a specific tool with advantages and disadvantages. It has 3 basic components. The first is a social media app, which sadly died just this Wednesday, to collect user eye data via Twitter's API, which formerly allowed you to collect data from people who consented to allow you to pull content from their Twitter timelines. Second component, a database of over 3,000 web domains pre-tagged for political bias and factual content. The data come from an excellent site known as Media Bias Fact Check, which graciously allowed us to access their database for free, which is awesome. Thank you, Media Bias Fact Check. And then the final component is a survey that we use to collect basic demographic, political, and media opinion data from an opt-in panel of users. And so, because we worked with an external survey firm, we were able to anonymously collect this content, as well as link the survey data to the timeline data, which was really neat. So the current research project, we have a bunch of things we want to do with this data. But just to give you a rundown of what we did, we recruited a little over 1,000 US demographically matched users from the panel company Dynata. Who were great, by the way. Each one filled out a survey and granted PIEGraph permission to collect their data. So it turns out that it was very easy to get people to do our survey, but incredibly difficult to get them to consent to let us look at their timeline. I think this is probably because we didn't pay them enough. Our budget for user compensation was probably should have been a little higher. So next time I do something like this, definitely pay them more. Because we had a huge drop-off from folks who did the survey, but then when we asked them to do the Twitter thing, they were like, no thanks. Even though most of the money was actually tied up in the Twitter consent aspect. Yes, Chris?
If you don't mind, can you just describe, was it hard for them to opt in? Did they have to approve an app within Twitter or something?
They did have to do that. So the way it worked was, they got the survey, they did that, and then literally the next thing after they clicked that was a button that said, you know how it is when you do a Twitter thing, it's like, authorize this app. There was a lot of drop off after that. So a lot of people simply didn't click that button. We did extensive testing. We actually, at one point, we did a thing where we doubled the compensation, no effect. So clearly, I think we needed to hit that threshold. We went from $5 to $10. I think we probably needed to be more like in the 20, 25 range, you know, but we'll see. But we won't see. But should I ever do this again, definitely pay them more money. So yeah, I will definitely let mine, so when I, in the grant application, I'll be like, we tried this at lower amounts, this is why I'm asking you for this much compensation. Anyway, so they're compensated after permission was granted. What's really nice about this particular project was that after the participants granted us permission to snoop on their timelines, no further participant action or background software was required. And so from the participant standpoint, it was actually quite easy and transparent. And of course, participants were allowed and instructed to opt out anytime by instructions on their website, and some folks actually did this. Track participants for minimum of a year. That's funny. We just about made it, right? Because we finished compiling our panel at the end of May. And yeah, so we got cut off on Wednesday, so not quite a year, but we were pretty close. And we had some data leading up to the full completion of our panel, which is incomplete, but like, as you move forward in time, it gets better and better, so, yeah. Anyway, this image is a representation of what you would have seen if you clicked the Authorize This App button. And this was directly inspired by web historian, and you know, when I used to give this presentation back when the Twitter API actually worked for this thing, it was nice, and it was interactive, you could mouse over it, and then the name of each of the domains represented by these bubbles would pop up, it was real pretty. But this is just a, you know, now I'm thinking about it just standing here talking to you. I really should have done like a nice little screencast for you, a little video. But you're gonna have to make do with the still image here. And imagine like my little mouse coming over here, doing like this, right? You see it? There it is. And then as I would do this, like the name of that domain was represented by that big purple blob would pop up. And you would know that that particular domain was the most frequently occurring within my particular timeline. I think that one belongs to Slate.com. Not that I'm a huge Slate reader, but Slate is very prolific and I follow them, so that's why that one would be so big. What's really important about this particular chart is that the left-right dimension maps onto our traditional understanding of left and right conservative liberal politics, and the vertical dimension maps onto information quality as determined by media bias fact check, which has 6 levels thereof, ranging from very low to very high. And as you can see, the vast majority of my content, this actually does represent me as an individual, falls into that upper right quadrant, which is left-leaning and on the higher end of the quality scale, although I do have a little bit of content to the right of center, most of which, except for this one here, is actually above the fold in terms of information quality. So that's great, and the idea was to give people some insight into both the ideological cast of their feed, which probably wouldn't be that huge of a surprise, and then potentially, and then also the information quality or fact quality, which might have been more surprising for some people. So that was a little thank you that we gave them, in addition to the monetary compensation that we also gave them. Let me talk a little bit about Media Bias Fact Check, which is a website that you can visit right now. Don't visit it right now, visit it after this presentation. Pay attention to me. This is a site that offers comprehensive coverage of many widely used English language news and political sites. They give detailed explanations of the ratings. There are a number of different organizations that do this kind of thing. Another one you may have heard of is News Vault. But News Vault is a for-profit company. Actually, Media Bias Fact Check is too. But News Vault actually sells their data. But sadly, News Vault's terms of service are not very fortuitous. They wanted me to pay $6,000 for a 1-year license, which I was not happy about. And then Media Bias Fact Check gave it to me for free, so very obvious which one I was going to go with. Also very high quality, not coincidentally. The data from Media Bias Fact Check have been used in multiple peer-reviewed studies, including the one I'm about to submit based on this, which hopefully will be peer-reviewed at some point in the future. But really good stuff. And let me just show you an example of a Media Bias Fact Check page. This is the one from New York Times. You can see that they have rated it on the ideological scale, left of center, and they've given it its second highest rating, factual reporting, which is high. And they give a little bit of explanation of what left center bias means. And if you want to check out this particular page, you can see it here at the URL at the bottom. And Media Bias Fact Check has one of these pages for each of the sites that it rates, all 3,400 some of them. And so it ends up giving pretty good coverage to the vast majority of the widely visited political and news sites that are English language and US focused. And there are a few international ones like the BBC and other things that are also widely read here in the States. So this is a chart of Media Bias Fact Check sites, all 3,400 of them, that are mapped out. Each dot here basically represents one sort of point on the graph. I aggregated them, not exactly sextiles, but it's, well, I guess that's about 9 of them. Yeah, so I aggregated them so they wouldn't be like dots all over the chart. Anyway, you can look at, if you look at this in terms of dividing the grid into fourths, you can see that the distribution is actually quite interesting here. Most of the higher quality sites end up moving, or are placed rather, in the upper left-hand corner. And there are a very small number, relatively smaller number, of those that are in the lower left. However, most of the lower quality sites are here on the right, the lower right. Especially if you compare the lower right to the upper right, there's a big difference there. Now, this of course has something to do with how the Media Bias Fact Check raters rated this content. However, I will note that this particular distribution is actually quite consistent with other peer-reviewed scholarly research on the topic. And so that's a good reality check to have in mind as we think about employing this kind of data in our research. So I'm going to give a few examples of high and low quality sites. If you'll take a look at the scores here, the factual repo score, that is corresponds to the 6 levels of factual reporting offered by Media Bias Fact Check. 3 corresponds to very high, 2 corresponds to high. You can see the New York Times is at 2. Other media outlets of which you may be aware include New York Magazine, New York Daily News, because I took the screenshot on ends, as well as capturing some other local news sources, including the Northwest Indiana Times, the Northwest Florida Daily News, and Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette, and NPR, which, by the way, is not a state-sponsored media organization, as many of you may have heard. Talk about that later if you really want to. Okay, so these are some high-quality ones. Here's an example of some low-quality ones. Many of these may not be recognizable to you, but some of them might be. If you'll notice, there's RT, Russia Today, the famous propaganda outlet, Sputnik, another Russian propaganda outlet. There's also the Angry Patriot, and the Gateway Pundit, which is a very famous purveyor of disinformation from the United States. All of these have a -2, which corresponds to Media Bias Fact Check's lowest rating, which is very low. And yeah, bad stuff, don't go to these except for scholarly purposes only. This is not something you should put any sort of stock in, because these people lie for a living, and apparently it is quite a lucrative one. So, back on a theoretical tip, a lot of people who know me know this is a huge bugbear of mine personally. I don't like the term fake news. I mean, I think it's fine as a rhetorical objective study. I don't think it's really good as an analytical term. In other words, not a term you should use, as a concept that you're trying to measure, because of its like polysemic slipperiness, rhetorician in the house. So we try to move from this. A lot of the research in this area has used these binary lists of, fake news or low quality content, and it's given the impression that content is either low quality or, you know, the sort of opposite or reciprocal of that would be high quality. And so what we're trying to do with this research is move from this kind of binary conception of good and bad, black and white, to a more continuous fact quality rating that covers most of the major media and political outlets that Americans are likely to visit. And so, you know, with apologies to my ecologically minded friends, I give a metaphor here that is to water quality, or pollution parts per million. So there are two major factors that affect either ppm or, in our case, fact quality level. So one would be each site's inherent potential level of harm. The second would be the project. So you can imagine a site that has the worst possible level of harm. -2 is the worst of the worst. But if it only appears in very, very small amounts, it's not a big deal. There's not a lot of it. Now, contrastingly, let us consider a site that is perhaps in the middle, right, mixed or some such, but it is quite ubiquitous. And so even though its overall inherent level of harm is lower, it has the potential to do much more damage due to its prevalence. And so this is something that the perspective that I'm using in this project will allow us to incorporate as we try to figure out the overall average level of people's exposure to low quality content, potential exposure to low quality content. And importantly, this perspective acknowledges that even mostly reputable sites can still carry misleading content at times, right? So rather than saying, okay, well, you know, here's the bad stuff and here's the good stuff, it's like, well, you know, it's high, but it's not quite the highest level. So that means every once in a while some bad stuff will creep in. So that nuanced perspective, I think, is quite important for the work in this area, quantitative work in this area moving forward. So let me just lay out a few research questions that I will attempt to answer in a rather rudimentary way in this presentation. The first being, how are mean fact quality and mean ideological bias distributed across participants? How is participant mean fact quality related to mean ideological bias? To what extent do political self-identification and mainstream media habits align with information environment contents? And to what extent do the following factors predict mean fact quality? Political self-identification, mainstream media, beliefs and habits, conspiracy beliefs, as well as identity factors, including race, gender, age, and a bunch of other ones. Got a lot to do, so let's get to it. All right, so data overview. After all of our attrition folks, people who indicated they did not want to be part of the study, which we're completely honored, we were left with 935 participants. We removed participants with fewer than 20 media bias fact check coded link instances, and that left us, these people who get very, very little news and politics content in their feeds, and so after we got rid of those, that gave us an N of 790, so it's not too bad in terms of going down from 9 to 35. And so overall, we had 24.8 million media bias fact check coded link instances. It's a link instance because we count each instance of it uniquely or individually rather than collapsing that down to unique appearances. And that goes from December 2021 to January 2023. That includes 13.7 million unique links, 135.8 million unique tweets, with a match rate of about 10.1%. That in and of itself is a very interesting research question. It dovetails with political science since the 1960s, showing that people generally don't tend to, most people don't tend to pay a whole lot of attention to politics, right? So what that 10% represents. And so one of the main research questions going forward that I want to explore with this data, that I don't explore here, because it's going to take some clever thinking to get into it, is what about the remaining 90%? Are there certain political types of content in that 90% that the methods that I detail here are insufficient to capture? My instinct there is probably yes, but then if I can't capture it with these methods, the question would then be, what methods should I use to try to figure out how politics is being discussed outside of the typical domains and places where you expect to find politics, e.g. New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Fox News, whatever. You think about this. You think about this. It's good. So these are race and gender distributions. This is just, I wanted to show a whole lot of descriptive data about the data set, just so you have some idea of the kinds of users I'm working with. As you can see, it's overwhelmingly white to the tune of about 70%. Black population is slightly overrepresented. You have some other categories there. Demographic categories are never ideal, but I try to do my best. Gender-wise, it's about even. Well, women are overrepresented. Men are not that underrepresented. There are a few who indicated alternative genders, very small. Other than cis men and women, it's a very small number there. Religion and age distributions, as you can see, the South is, region and age distribution, not religion. So the South is slightly overrepresented. Actually, it's massively overrepresented. The Midwest, West, and Northeast are comparably represented relative to each other, hovering around about 20%. Age-wise, you can see that 45 to 64 is the largest age category, followed by 25 to 44, and then the other three are somewhat less than that. Sorry, that's my calendar making noise. This is left-right ideological orientation. This is self-assigned. So you can see that moderate is the highest, with over 25% of individuals identifying as such. Then you have sort of a little bit of an interesting curve here, where you have people who are very liberal and very conservative, directly above those who are slightly liberal and slightly conservative. And you got a few here over at the side who are neutral or apolitical there. In terms of party orientation, this is somewhat similar, although more people tend to identify as strong Dems. And then secondly, you've got independents, moderate Dem, lean Dem, same for the Republican Party, slightly more Democrats than Republicans, a few entering alternative parties, a little over 2.5%, indicating parties that were neither Democrat nor Republican, but of course, as a category, that was the smallest by far. Mainstream media satisfaction, the modal answer here was satisfied. The least popular answer was very satisfied. And then you had a distribution going downward from neither to dissatisfied and then to very dissatisfied. The next one is mainstream media time spent. The modal answer here is 30 minutes to an hour, and then you have a little bit on either side. Some people spend 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 3, descending as you go up, and then also as you get less than that, 15 minutes to 30, less than 15 minutes, and so on and so forth. So about half an hour to an hour is where the biggest answer there. Finally, let's get into a few conspiracy theories. I'm not going to show descriptive statistics for all of these, but I will show them for 2. This is the belief that the COVID pandemic was intentional. As you can see, the modal answer here, thankfully, is definitely not true. But there are substantial numbers of folks, if you add together definitely true and probably true, you stack those on top of each other, you get over 40%. So this is a pretty popular answer here. And then not sure, I might actually feel a little bit worse than that, but definitely true and probably true, folks. Folks should really think about that a little bit. But this is just going to show you that, some people actually believe this kind of thing. Next one I'm going to show for this is belief that January 6th was, quote, not that serious. That's how we talked about it on the survey. So a little bit less belief on this one than for the COVID one. As you can see, you get well over 50% if you stack disagree and strongly disagree. But there are, people who, again, do believe this. You get probably, what would that be, maybe in the 25% range or so if you combine strongly agree with agree. So again, it's not nothing in terms of people who actually believe this. Next up, I'm going to get into some descriptive statistics. This is the mean ideological leaning or bias distribution. So every single user is represented here. And this just goes to show that our data set are somewhat left-leaning. And this is based on the average ideological rating of the content in their feeds, right? So you have a small group of people that sort of lean right, where their average content for the links that are appearing in their feeds falls to the right center, and then most people, as you can see, once you get below about the 75th percentile or so, everybody below that is roughly is going to be about left of center there. And so so this is just really, really important data for understanding some of the models, and I'll show a little later. This is the equivalent for the fat quality distribution. As you can see, most people kind of fall into a mid-range here, between sort of mostly factual and very high. Thankfully, very small numbers of people fall below the mixed average down here. There are very few people down here in the low and very low, which is great. But similarly, a very small number of people get above very high over here. So most people, you know, in terms of fat quality, they're kind of right in the middle, right? Maybe a little bit higher than average, but not super, super high and not really low. Finally, some late breaking news. I actually crunched this data just for y'all. Well, not just for y'all, but just newly today I did this. This is the total amount of tweets across all personalized information environments, the volume, starting in the month when we completed our user recruitment and continuing to the end of last month. So as you can see, you know, it's dipping a little bit. One of the things you will notice is that the biggest dip is actually from August to September of last year. But I will point out that ever since Elon Musk took over at the very end of October, beginning of November, there's been a steady decline in all months except for between February and March. And so this may occur for a number of reasons, including one, that people are deleting their accounts. Secondly, it also could be because people are leaving their accounts intact but simply using them less. And so the idea being here that there can be some major effects when there are policy changes at the top here. And so, you know, certainly very suggestive that we would need to dig a bit deeper to figure out exactly what's going on here. Sadly, we can't do that because the Twitter API is not gone, but prohibitively expensive. So, this next one is mean ideological leaning over time. You can probably ignore everything to the left of May of 2022 because there's a little jitter there because our panel wasn't complete prior to that. But what I find most interesting about this is the lack of change in contrast with the previous slide from the pre to the post-Musk era. And so there's not, for example, what we might expect, which might be a strong lurch to the right. As you can see, it stays pretty stable, and people tend to get the same kind of content that they were getting in their feeds, at least in terms of average ideology, being very similar before Musk took after as well as afterward. And finally, it's a very similar story if you look at mean fat quality over time. So there's not a huge dip in fat quality after Musk takes over, at least with our panel. Pretty much good continuity there, and so I think that's a good, reality check to see that. And also findings that oppose a little bit, or that seem to be contradict some of the other research, which I actually don't think is a peer review at this point, finding that there's been a lot more hate speech, other problematic speech that we've seen on Twitter after Musk took over. A lot of that work is done by non-academic researchers. It's done by think tanks and things like that. And so I'm very interested in seeing the academic research, peer-reviewed research on those kinds of questions. And this will be one study, I'm sure, among many that look at that particular question. This is mean ideological bias by mean fat quality. Like, I didn't have enough time to draw like a little convex parabola on here, but I did sort of Pearson's correlation. Yes, there is the correlation, but I squared ideology so that it's not a linear, but looks like it has a little bit of a curve to it, and that actually gives us a much higher coefficient, stronger coefficient. What that means, in practice, as a practical matter, is that the extremes on the ideological scale tend to be the ones with the lowest mean fat quality. So it's not driven by the left and the right. A much stronger model here is people who are at the extremes of the left and the right having that very, very low fat quality. So you can sort of imagine that parabola, if you will, kind of arcing and sort of peaking in the middle and then curving down to each side. And that's really mathematically what tends to work out best for this. Real quick, I'm going to wrap up with a few models here. These are all these are full models, and they've got, these are standardized coefficients I'm using here. This model tries to predict, and so MBFC coded tweets, it's looking at a percentage on an individual basis of each user's feeds that were coded by media bias fact checking. So the higher number here indicates a higher content, or higher quantity rather, of political content. And so the two predictors that were significant here are MSM frequency. Also, all the predictors are from the survey. MSM frequency, so the amount of content that you said you consumed from mainstream media, which we would expect that to be true. And then age. So the older you were, the more political content you had in your feed. Again, makes sense with what we know about existing research. Next one looks at same thing, but for ideological bias, with higher values corresponding to conservative, to being more conservative. And so you can see that the more satisfied you were with the mainstream media, right, the less conservative your feed was. Mainstream media frequency, the more you consume it, the more conservative it was. The more you said you were conservative, the more conservative it was, obviously. It'd be a real problem if it was the opposite. The more, I can see this. Let's see, party, again, the more Republican you were, the more conservative it was. The more you said January 6th was exaggerated, the more conservative your feed was. And of course, the older you were, the more conservative your feed was. And so, some of these I think are somewhat, obvious, but this is, I think, pretty much what you expect based on what the dependent variable is here. And the final one is what we've all been waiting for. This is fact quality. And so we have a number of significant predictors here, including frequency of mainstream media use. In other words, the more you use mainstream media, the lower your fact quality was. The more you use Twitter, the lower your fact quality was. So there's actually a study that just came out in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing that chronic use of these systems tends to make people more susceptible to misinformation. So these findings actually go right along with that. The more you believe that January 6th was exaggerated, again, the lower your fact quality was. The more you believed that the pandemic was planned, that also predicts lower. That one's barely significant. That one's just touching it, so very close there. Interestingly enough, the more you believe that the media and politics is run by a Jewish conspiracy, that actually predicted a higher fact quality, which is kind of puzzling. I think this one might be sort of a monitorial issue, right? So you're trying to keep your eye on this sort of mainstream content. Could be one explanation for this. And so, but also another really important fact I'll talk about briefly later is that what this shows is that not all conspiracy theories are created equal. So some tend to predict low quality as we'd expect, and some, at least one here, predicts higher quality. And so we'll want to think about that as we are trying to consider the impact of different conspiracy theories on the relationship, rather, between belief in various conspiracy theories and the amount of low quality content that people are seeing in their feeds. So again, this is a recap of some of the stuff I've talked about. The data set skews heavily white, mostly female, middle-aged, Southern, Democratic, fairly balanced ideologically, despite that. Substantial minorities believe the COVID conspiracy, as well as the big lie. Media bias scores skew left, mean fact quality scores skew mostly factual above, which would give us some, make it feel good in some ways. The prevalence of low fact quality sites is rare overall. However, there is a bit of a disconnect between the extent to which people believe in conspiracy theories and the amount of low quality content they consume. And that's actually something that's been found by previous research as well. So trying to figure out the relationship between information consumption and endorsement of various conspiracy theories is an empirical puzzle that we're still trying to puzzle out, trying to figure out what's going on there. The biggest predictor across all of the models is reported time spent consuming media. And so I really think, and this is also in context with other relevant research, I really think that there is something here about consuming lots of content and that in some way, wearing down, or perhaps maybe wearing down one's critical faculties, opening the door for content that is low quality, as media bias fact check would say. And so trying to figure out how to do that and what to do with that, I think is a really, really important topic for research on this going forward. age is strongly related to political and conservative content, but not to low-quality content or content quality. People's environments generally line up with their stated political commitments, which is good, that's what we expect. For fact quality, again, as I mentioned earlier, not all conspiracy theories are created equal. January 6th tourists, or people who believe that January 6th was not that big a deal, had lower mean quality, but Jewish conspiracy believers had higher mean quality. There could be some aspect of monitorial vigilance here, trying to keep your eye on what's going on there. And so trying to figure out what some of those differences might be in terms of the content of the different conspiracy theories is a really important direction to go for this research moving forward. I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about PIEGraph versus some of the approaches in terms of advantages and disadvantages. This would be more relevant if this was a research project going forward, but not anyway. And so we're able to not necessarily see what the user sees as a bit of an exaggeration. We don't necessarily know if they're seeing this content, but a better way of describing it would be the content that the users have said they want to see. So I interpret it as an indicator of user content preference. So you follow content, that indicates that it's content you want to see. And the correlation between self-described ideology and the ideology as indicated by the media bias fact check ratings, I think, is strong evidence of that. We capture more than just URLs. We capture hashtags and usernames and the full text of the tweets. And so future research using the data set that we've created, we'll be able to marshal those as we try to answer some of the other questions that I've hinted on and touched on throughout this presentation. We can cover both mobile and laptop content through API access, or we could do that. The pre-tag database that we have that's based on media bias fact check is highly extensible, so we could label other types of links, for example, not just by politics or ideology and fact quality, but by the type of content it is, whether it's entertainment, sports, medical, health, religious, or whatever you want to talk about. The system is lightweight, non-intrusive, and fault-tolerant. Of course, we weren't planning on making it open source. We're still trying to decide whether that's really worth the time and effort given what happened to the Twitter API, so stay tuned. The disadvantages include that it only supports Twitter for now, and, well, you see what putting all your eggs in one basket gets you? The architecture doesn't support non-internet apps, since it's internet only. Doesn't capture what users click on, so this is the inverse of the problem that NetQuest and similar commercial concerns have. They only capture what people click on. We only capture what comes through the feed. So ideally, you'd be able to get both, but I don't think anybody's quite nailed that yet. And then, sadly, what I really love about this last bullet point is I wrote it before Elon Musk actually took over Twitter, and sadly, my former self is now laughing at me because I called this in 2018, and sadly, it has come to pass that PIEGraph was, of course, vulnerable to changes in corporate data policy. Womp womp. So that's how that works. Echo chambers meant to mapping pies, right? So echo chambers asks, the concept of echo chambers implicitly asks, are these personalized information environments echo chambers? PIEGraph and similar research asks, what are in these pies? Not fruit, but actual political content, right? So examples of kinds of content that we could pursue, use this data to look at after this initial study include different types of content aside from simply political content, such as health, medical, religious, educational, entertainment, finance, religious, that kind of stuff. Identities, including racial, gender, LGBTQ, international diversity, media types, such as local versus national media, independent versus corporate media, and then finally, again, not an exhaustive list, but we can incorporate better misinformation measurements, incorporating tools like optical character recognition to try to extract text from images, name entity recognition, large language models, and etc. So final plug for seeing like a user, people are affected by much more than what they click on. Exposure to headlines, hashtags, and other inline content can shape people's views. From a psychology, the illusory truth effect and confirmation bias can amplify this tendency over time. And the last thing I'll leave you with is the fact that PIEGraph and other user approaches are complementary. There is a magic bullet for this as far as I know, although I do know somebody who's working on one. We'll see how well that goes. But for now, this I think is a really important direction for people who are interested in social media to consider. And I'm going to stop there. So you can ask whatever questions you have.
Time for some questions. I'll pass around the mic.
I was just wondering if you had a distribution of the amount of coded link instances, like across the user base that you guys were tracing? Because I'm wondering if some of the weirdness of like the conspiracy theory stuff might be explained by the fact that there's such a small amount of the sample in that, or that they had such a small number of links in their timeline, or like how that frequency of links in their timeline would like relate to these other variables that you're looking at, which I think would be is super interesting.
Yeah. We do have that data. That is the data engineer that I have working on this. He understands data ontology a little bit better than I do, and so I was able to run most of this stuff myself, but that was what he would have to run. And so unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to get that done before this presentation. But we do have that data, and we will include it in the paper that we're going to submit. We're actually working on a paper for a special issue that we're going to submit at the end of April, and so that will be something we'll include to try to figure out the distribution of media bias fact check coded link instances, and try to connect that with some of the data around conspiracy theory endorsement. Of course, one of the issues that we run into is that the fact that there seems to be this recurring finding where people are not engaging a whole lot with what seem to be the worst of the worst sites, but they're still endorsing these conspiracy theories at very high rates, is something that's been found repeatedly. And so I think that that piece is not likely to be